The department's personnel records showed that Harry Callahan had been formally partnered with 11 different officers over the course of his 26-year career, a number that was unremarkable on its surface. Detectives changed partners for all the ordinary reasons that police departments rotated personnel, promotions and transfers and retirements, and the simple administrative churn that any large institution generates over a quarter century. What the personnel records did not show, because personnel records were not designed to capture this kind of pattern and because nobody in the department's administrative apparatus had ever been positioned to notice it, was the specific and consistent cost that each of those 11 partnerships had extracted from the people who entered them. 3 of Harry's partners had been seriously injured in the line of duty during their partnership with him, injuries severe enough to end their careers in active police work. 2 had requested transfers to other divisions within 18 months of being assigned to work with him, transfers that were processed without official comment but that everyone who reviewed the paperwork understood to be a response to something specific about the experience of working alongside Harry Callahan. 1 had died. The other 5 had completed their partnerships with Harry without catastrophic incident and had gone on to other assignments, other partners, other careers within the department. But even these 5 carried something forward from the experience that distinguished them, in subtle and lasting ways, from officers who had never worked directly alongside him. A particular wariness, a specific quality of caution that some of them described, decades later, as the most valuable thing their early careers had given them and that others described as a wound that had never fully closed. Tom Driscoll was the first partner the department assigned to Harry, in 1958, 2 years into Harry's career, when the standard practice was to pair newer detectives with someone who could mentor them through the specific skills that academy training did not provide. Driscoll was older than Harry by 6 years and had been on the force longer, and the pairing was meant to run in the conventional direction, Driscoll mentoring Harry, not the reverse. What happened instead, over the 11 months the partnership lasted, was something that Driscoll himself described, in an interview conducted decades later for an internal department history project that was never published, as the most disorienting professional experience of his career. Harry had not been insubordinate. He had not challenged Driscoll's authority in any way that generated formal friction. He had simply, within a few months of the partnership beginning, developed an operational instinct that exceeded Driscoll's own, identifying patterns in cases that Driscoll's more conventional approach had missed, anticipating threats with a consistency that began to feel, to Driscoll, less like good instinct and more like something he didn't have a category for. The partnership ended when Driscoll was shot in the shoulder during a confrontation that Harry had argued, beforehand, required more caution than Driscoll had been willing to extend, and that had unfolded, when Driscoll's instincts proved wrong and Harry's proved right, in exactly the way Harry had predicted. The shoulder injury was not career-ending. Driscoll returned to duty within 4 months. But he requested reassignment immediately upon his return, citing personal reasons that the request did not specify, and the department, with the particular institutional incuriosity that governed most personnel decisions of this kind, approved the transfer without further inquiry. Driscoll spent the remaining 19 years of his career in a different division and rarely discussed his time working with Harry Callahan, and when he did discuss it, in the unpublished interview decades later, he described the experience with a specific combination of professional respect and personal unease that he found difficult to fully articulate even to an interviewer whose explicit purpose was helping him articulate it. What Driscoll's experience established, in the earliest years of Harry's career, was a pattern that would repeat with variations across every subsequent partnership. Working alongside Harry required a recalibration of professional self-understanding that most officers found genuinely difficult to sustain. This was not because Harry was difficult to work with in the conventional sense. He was not abrasive, not insubordinate, not prone to the kind of interpersonal friction that made some partnerships fail through simple incompatibility. It was because Harry's operational capability was of a different order than what most officers, even good ones, brought to the work, and being partnered with someone of that capability produced a specific psychological experience that combined genuine professional benefit with a harder-to-name cost. You learn things working alongside Harry Callahan that you could not learn any other way. You also, almost inevitably, confronted the limits of your own capability in a way that most careers allowed officers to avoid confronting, because most careers did not put officers in sustained proximity to someone whose pattern recognition and threat assessment operated at the speed and accuracy that Harry's had developed. The confrontation was not always comfortable. For some officers, like Driscoll, it produced a recalibration that, while disorienting, ultimately strengthened their own subsequent careers. Driscoll himself acknowledged, in the unpublished interview, that the 11 months with Harry had taught him things about threat assessment that had likely saved his life on at least 2 occasions in the years that followed, even as the months themselves had been among the most difficult of his career. For others, the confrontation produced something closer to genuine harm. Frank Kowalski was Harry's partner for 2 years, from 1961 to 1963, and Kowalski's experience represented the second category, the partnership that produced lasting harm rather than complicated benefit. Kowalski had been a competent, well-regarded detective before his partnership with Harry began, with a solid if unremarkable record and the kind of steady professional reputation that most officers aspired to and few achieved with real consistency. The partnership with Harry changed something in Kowalski that his colleagues noticed without being able to fully name, a gradual shift in his confidence and his decision-making that became visible over the 2 years they worked together and that several of his colleagues, interviewed years later for the same unpublished department history project, attributed directly to the specific psychological pressure of sustained comparison with Harry's capabilities. Kowalski had not been a bad detective before the partnership. He became, over the 2 years, a detective who second-guessed himself in ways he had not previously second-guessed himself, who developed a hesitation in situations that called for decisive action, who seemed, to the people who had known him before, to be operating with a confidence that had been systematically eroded by 2 years of measuring himself against a standard that very few officers, in the entire history of the department, were capable of meeting. The erosion was not Harry's intention. Harry had never treated Kowalski with anything other than professional respect, had never explicitly compared their relative capabilities, had never done anything that would constitute, in any formal sense, mistreatment of his partner. The erosion happened anyway, through the simple and unavoidable mechanism of sustained proximity to a standard that most human beings, confronting it daily over an extended period, found psychologically costly to sustain contact with. Kowalski requested reassignment in 1963. He left police work entirely 4 years later, citing burnout, and spent the remainder of his career in private security, a career that he later described, to a former colleague who maintained contact with him, as adequate but never as engaging as the work had been before something in him had changed during the 2 years with Callahan. The partner who died was named Eddie Morrison, and his death, in 1967, was the single event in Harry's career that came closest to producing the kind of visible, public, undeniable cost that might have generated a serious institutional reckoning with the pattern Harry's partnerships represented. And the fact that it did not produce such a reckoning, that the department absorbed Morrison's death into its operational history without ever seriously examining the specific dynamics of the partnership that had preceded it, was itself a significant fact about how the institution related to Harry Callahan and the costs his exceptional capability imposed on the people closest to him. Morrison had been partnered with Harry for 14 months when he died, shot during a confrontation with an armed suspect in a situation that the after-action review characterized, in the careful and ultimately exculpatory language such reviews specialized in, as an unavoidable tragedy produced by the inherent risks of the work rather than by any specific failure of judgment or coordination between the 2 officers. This characterization was accurate as far as it went and incomplete in a way that several officers who had worked alongside both men privately understood and never officially stated. Morrison had been a solid, careful, conventionally skilled detective whose instincts, while reliable by ordinary standards, were not calibrated to the specific and unusual threat assessment speed that Harry had developed over a decade of exactly these situations. In the confrontation that killed him, Morrison had positioned himself according to standard tactical doctrine that would have been entirely adequate in a situation that matched its assumptions, in a confrontation that Harry had already, in the seconds before the positioning mattered, recognized as not matching those assumptions. Harry had begun to redirect Morrison's positioning. The redirection had not completed before the suspect fired. Morrison died at the scene. Harry, who had been 3 feet from a position that would have likely produced the same outcome for him, survived because his own positioning, calibrated to his own faster and more accurate threat assessment, had already begun the movement that Morrison's positioning had not yet caught up to. Harry never discussed Eddie Morrison's death with anyone in any detail beyond what the official investigation required. He attended the funeral. He did not speak at it, though he had been asked. He visited Morrison's widow once, in the weeks after the death, a visit that she later described to a department chaplain as brief and largely silent, Harry sitting in her living room for approximately 20 minutes saying very little, and her own grief too immediate and overwhelming at the time to fully process what his presence and his silence had meant, though she came to understand, in the years that followed, that the visit had been Harry's version of the only acknowledgement he was capable of making. Not an apology, because Harry never believed an apology was owed in any sense that the standard understanding of the word would recognize, and not an explanation, because explaining the specific tactical calculus of those final seconds would have served no purpose except to make a grieving widow understand exactly how close her husband had come to a different outcome and how the difference had come down to a calibration of instinct that Morrison, through no failure of his own, had not possessed. The visit had simply been presence. Harry had understood that something was owed, in the absence of any specific debt he could identify as actionable, and presence was what he had to offer, and he had offered it, briefly and silently, and then returned to work, because work was the thing that remained. And Eddie Morrison's death had not changed that fact, even though it had changed almost everything else about how Harry approached the question of who he was willing to work closely alongside. After Morrison's death, Harry's relationship with the partnership system changed in ways that the department's administrative apparatus registered without ever fully understanding. He did not refuse partners. Refusing partners was not an option the department structure made available to individual detectives, and Harry had never been someone who pushed against structural constraints he couldn't actually change. But his engagement with subsequent partners became measurably different, more careful in a specific direction that several officers who worked with him in the years after 1967 noticed without entirely understanding what they were noticing. Harry began, consciously or not, managing the calibration gap that had killed Morrison. Taking on more of the immediate tactical risk himself in situations that called for split-second positioning decisions, structuring partnerships so that his partners were positioned in roles that required less of the specific instantaneous threat assessment speed that Harry possessed and his partners, by definition, did not. This was not articulated as a policy. Harry never discussed it in these terms with anyone. But the pattern was visible to people who paid attention, and Bressler, who had become Harry's supervisor not long after Morrison's death, was one of the people who paid attention, and who understood, watching Harry's subsequent partnerships unfold, that he was observing a man who had built, out of the wreckage of a death he held himself responsible for in a way the official investigation had explicitly absolved him of, a permanent and largely unconscious system for absorbing risk that should have been shared and instead concentrated itself, partnership after partnership, in Harry alone. This concentration of risk produced its own cost, distinct from the costs Harry's partners had paid and additional to them. Harry's body carried the physical record of 26 years of absorbing more than his proportional share of the danger inherent in the work. The scars that the early scripts in this series have referenced, the gunshot wounds, the broken bones that had healed with the particular permanence of injuries sustained by a body that kept working through recovery periods that medical advice suggested should have been longer. Some of this cost would have existed regardless of Harry's relationship with his partners, simply as the accumulated physical toll of an exceptionally active and dangerous career. But a measurable portion of it, in the specific assessment that several people who knew Harry's full operational history privately maintained, was attributable to the post-Morrison pattern. To Harry's consistent positioning of himself in the role that absorbed the sharpest edge of tactical risk in any given confrontation, a positioning that protected his partners from exactly the kind of calibration gap that had killed Morrison and that cost Harry, cumulatively, across the partnerships that followed, a body that had been asked to absorb more than any single body should reasonably have been asked to absorb. He never described this as sacrifice. He never framed it, to himself or to anyone else, in the language of nobility or duty that might have made the pattern more legible to outside observers. It was simply, in his own private accounting, the correct allocation of risk given the relative calibration of everyone involved. A tactical decision rather than a moral one, even though the tactical decision had produced, over 2 decades, a body of cumulative cost that any honest accounting would have to describe in terms considerably closer to sacrifice than Harry himself was ever willing to use. The 5 partners who completed their assignments with Harry without catastrophic incident. Officers named Reyes, Thornton, Okafor, Bell, and finally Vasquez, whose brief informal involvement with the Strom case in Harry's final weeks constituted the closest thing to a formal partnership Harry maintained in the final phase of his career, each carried forward something specific from the experience, and the variation among what they carried illustrated the range of ways that proximity to Harry's particular capability could shape a career. Reyes, who had worked alongside Harry for 9 months in the late 1960s, went on to become one of the department's most respected training officers, building a curriculum for newer detectives that incorporated, without ever explicitly attributing it, several of the threat assessment principles she had absorbed from watching Harry work. Thornton left police work after his partnership with Harry to become a private investigator, a career shift that he attributed, in conversations with former colleagues, to having learned things about the limits of what official police work could accomplish that made the more flexible territory of private investigation feel like a more honest fit for the skills he had developed. Okafor and Bell both continued in conventional police careers, each carrying forward a permanent and slightly elevated baseline of operational caution that colleagues who worked with them in later years noted without always understanding its origin. And Vasquez, the youngest and most recent, carried forward something that was still actively forming when Harry's career ended. An unfinished apprenticeship, cut short by retirement rather than by injury or transfer or death, that left Vasquez with the specific and permanent task of carrying forward what he had learned in 2 intense days of working alongside a man at the very end of a 26-year career, without ever having had the longer sustained exposure that might have completed whatever transformation that brief and intense partnership had begun. What every partner Harry Callahan ever had shared, across the full range of outcomes from Driscoll's complicated growth to Kowalski's erosion to Morrison's death to the more ambiguous experiences of the 5 who completed their assignments intact, was the specific and permanent fact of having stood in close professional proximity to a capability that exceeded ordinary human calibration and having paid, in some form, for the proximity. The payment took different shapes. A shoulder wound and a transfer, a slow erosion of confidence, a death that left a widow and a brief silent visit that constituted the only acknowledgement Harry was capable of offering, a career redirected toward private investigation, a training curriculum quietly shaped by lessons never explicitly credited. But the payment was consistent in its underlying logic. Harry Callahan's exceptional quality was not a neutral fact that existed without cost to the people who worked alongside it. It generated cost the way exceptional things generally generate cost, through the specific and unavoidable mechanism of comparison, of calibration gaps, of the particular psychological and sometimes physical price extracted from ordinary capability when it is placed in sustained proximity to something that exceeds it. Harry had never sought this cost. He had never imposed it deliberately. But he had also never been able to eliminate it, because eliminating it would have required either diminishing his own capability, which was not a thing capability could simply choose to do, or working entirely alone, which the department structure did not permit and which Harry, despite everything the partnerships had cost the people who entered them, had never actually requested, because the work required partners even when the partners paid for the privilege of standing beside the work being done. Driving north in the March fog with the Calder file in the back seat, Harry thought, among the many things he thought about in that long unhurried drive away from 26 years of San Francisco, about the specific accounting of his partners. About Driscoll's shoulder and Kowalski's slow erosion and Eddie Morrison's widow sitting across from him in a living room 20 minutes of mostly silence 11 years ago and the 5 who had survived intact carrying forward what they carried, and about Vasquez, most recently, beginning an apprenticeship that would now never complete in the way Harry's own apprenticeship under nobody in particular had eventually completed itself through 26 years of exactly the kind of accumulation. Vasquez would now have to find some other way to build. This was not a comfortable accounting. Harry had never made it comfortable for himself, had never softened the specific knowledge that every person who had stood beside him in the work had paid something for the privilege, that his exceptional capability was not a gift he had given the city without cost to the individuals closest to it, that the ledger of his career included not just the cases closed and the threats neutralized and the city saved without acknowledgement but also the specific and permanent costs extracted from 11 people who had simply been assigned, by the ordinary administrative mechanisms of a large institution, to work alongside something they had never been adequately prepared to work alongside. Harry carried this knowledge the way he carried everything else, steadily, without performance, as part of the permanent architecture of what 26 years had built in him. Every partner he had ever had paid for it. He knew this completely. He had never found a way to make it not true. And he drove north anyway, because driving north was the only thing left to do, and the partners were behind him now, in the city, in their own subsequent careers and their own subsequent lives, carrying what they carried, the way Harry carried what he carried, each of them shaped permanently by an arrangement that none of them had fully chosen and that none of them, including Harry, had ever found a way to make less costly than it had always, inevitably, been. The department's official approach to partner assignments never accounted for what Harry's pattern represented, because the official approach had no mechanism for measuring the specific kind of cost that proximity to exceptional capability extracted from ordinary officers. The personnel system tracked injuries, tracked transfers, tracked the formal outcomes that could be entered into a record and reviewed by anyone with the appropriate access. It did not track the slow erosion of confidence that had reshaped Frank Kowalski's career, because erosion of confidence was not the kind of thing that generated a formal incident report. It did not track the specific quality of caution that Okafor and Bell carried forward into their later careers, because caution acquired through observation rather than through any specific traumatic event left no paper trail that the department systems were designed to capture. The cost was real and the cost was consistent and the cost was, in its own way, one of the most significant and least visible line items in the full accounting of what Harry Callahan's 26-year career had actually produced, not in the negative sense of harm inflicted deliberately, but in the structural sense of cost generated by the simple physics of placing ordinary capability in sustained proximity to extraordinary capability and asking the two to function as a unit. The department had never examined this dynamic, not because the examination would have been impossible but because examining it would have required confronting, yet again, the same uncomfortable question that every honest accounting of Harry Callahan's career eventually arrived at. That his exceptional value to the city had been produced through methods and circumstances that the department's official framework could not fully sanction, and that the cost of those methods had been distributed not just onto Harry himself and not just onto the suspects he confronted but onto the colleagues closest to him, in a pattern that nobody in any position of institutional authority had ever been willing to name directly, let alone address. Bressler, in his retirement remarks, had spoken about dedication and about people who had given the job something they couldn't get back, and the officers in that break room who understood the subtext had understood it as applying to Harry's own sacrifice, to what the job had cost Harry personally. What fewer of them understood, because fewer of them had the specific knowledge required to understand it, was that Bressler's words could have applied with equal accuracy to the 11 people who had been partnered with Harry over 26 years, each of whom had given the job something they couldn't get back, in costs that ranged from a shoulder wound to a life to the slow and undocumented erosion of confidence that no formal record had ever captured. Bressler knew this. He had watched it happen, partnership after partnership, across the 22 years he had supervised Harry's career, and he had never found a way to address it structurally, because addressing it structurally would have required either removing Harry from active partnership work, which would have eliminated the operational benefit the department depended on, or providing some form of support to the partners that acknowledged the specific psychological cost of working alongside him, which would have required officially naming a dynamic that the department had spent decades carefully not naming. Bressler had done what Donnelly would later do in his own management of Harry's career. He had absorbed the uncomfortable knowledge privately, managed its visible consequences as they arose, and protected the overall arrangement because the overall arrangement, despite its costs, produced outcomes that the department needed and that no alternative arrangement seemed capable of replicating. This was not a comfortable choice. Bressler had never pretended it was comfortable. But it was the choice the institution had made, implicitly and repeatedly, across 26 years, and the cost had been paid by 11 specific people whose names appeared in personnel records that nobody had ever cross-referenced against each other to notice the pattern they collectively represented. Eddie Morrison's widow, a woman named Carol Morrison, raised their 2 children alone after 1967, and she carried forward her own specific relationship with the knowledge of what had happened to her husband, a relationship that was neither simple anger at Harry nor simple acceptance of the official explanation that the after-action review had provided. She had eventually, years later, come to understand something close to what Bressler understood, though she had arrived at it through grief rather than through institutional proximity. That her husband's death had been produced not by any specific failure of judgment on anyone's part but by the simple and tragic mathematics of placing a good, conventionally skilled officer in sustained partnership with someone whose capabilities operated at a different order of magnitude, in work where the gap between those capabilities could, in the wrong 60 seconds, prove fatal. She did not forgive Harry, in the sense that forgiveness implies an offense requiring absolution, because she came to understand, over years of sitting with the knowledge, that there had been no offense in the sense the word usually carried, simply a tragedy produced by structural conditions that nobody, including Harry, had fully controlled or fully understood until the conditions had already produced their worst possible outcome. She raised her children. She moved, eventually, to Oregon, where her sister lived, and she built a life that incorporated the loss without being permanently organized around it, in the way that grief, given enough years and enough deliberate effort, sometimes allows. She thought about Harry Callahan occasionally, in the specific way that you think about people who were present at the most significant rupture in your life, and what she thought, most consistently, across the years that followed, was not anger and was not gratitude but something more complicated. An acknowledgement that her husband had died doing work that mattered, alongside a man whose own capability had probably saved more lives than her husband's death had cost, and that this mathematics, while true, did not make the cost any less real or any less hers to carry, and that both things, the mattering and the cost, were simply, permanently, simultaneously true, in the way that the most difficult facts about difficult lives usually are. Vasquez, in the months after Harry's retirement, found himself thinking about the brief partnership more often than he had expected to when it was actually happening. 2 days was not enough time to build the kind of sustained working relationship that the department's formal partnership system was designed to produce, and Vasquez had understood, even while it was occurring, that what he was experiencing with Harry was something different from a standard partnership. A compressed and unusually intense exposure to a capability that he had only previously encountered through department legend, condensed into a file review, a single phone call, and the specific unspoken understanding that had passed between them when Vasquez chose not to ask what had happened in the parking garage. What Vasquez carried forward from this compressed exposure was, in its own way, a smaller-scale version of what every prior partner had carried forward. A recalibrated sense of what operational excellence could look like, a permanent awareness of a standard that very few officers in the department's history had ever fully met, and a specific and lasting uncertainty about whether his own subsequent career would be measured, by himself if by no one else, against the brief glimpse of something exceptional that 2 days with Harry Callahan had provided. He built his career carefully in the years that followed, developing his own version of the pattern recognition that Harry had demonstrated, never trying to replicate Harry's specific methods because he understood, with the appropriate humility, that Harry's methods had been built through 26 years of accumulation that could not be shortcut or imitated, but trying instead to honor what he had learned by applying it within his own capabilities and his own constraints, building a career that was, in its own more modest way, shaped permanently by 2 days that had cost him nothing in the way that Driscoll's shoulder or Morrison's life had cost something, but that had cost him, nonetheless, the simple and permanent loss of ever being able to approach his own work again without the specific knowledge of what a more complete version of the capability looked like. A knowledge that elevated his own performance and simultaneously, quietly, permanently, made it impossible for him to ever fully satisfy himself with what he was able to produce. This was, in the end, the full and honest accounting of what every partner Harry Callahan ever had paid for the privilege of working alongside him, not a uniform cost, not a single currency, but a range of payments extracted by the same underlying mechanism, the simple, unavoidable, structurally inevitable cost of sustained proximity to something exceptional. Driscoll paid in a shoulder wound and a transfer and a respect that never fully resolved into comfort. Kowalski paid in a confidence that eroded across 2 years and never fully rebuilt. Morrison paid with his life, and his widow paid in the particular grief of loving someone who had died in service of work that mattered, alongside a man whose own survival had been purchased by a calibration gap that nobody had chosen and nobody could have closed in time. Reyes and Thornton and Okafor and Bell paid in smaller, more diffuse ways, a curriculum shaped by unattributed lessons, a career redirected toward private investigation, a permanent baseline of caution that colleagues noticed without understanding its source. And Vasquez, most recently and most briefly, paid in the quiet, permanent impossibility of ever fully satisfying himself with his own subsequent work, having glimpsed, for 2 compressed days, what a more complete version of the capability looked like. 11 people. 11 different payments. One underlying cause, repeating itself across 26 years with the same essential logic each time. That working alongside Harry Callahan meant working alongside something that exceeded ordinary calibration, and that the gap between ordinary and exceptional, in work where the gap could matter in a single unforgiving second, was a gap that someone always ended up paying for, and that someone, across the full span of Harry's career, was never Harry himself in the way that mattered most, because Harry's payment was different. Was the accumulated physical cost of absorbing more than his share of the risk, was the permanent isolation of being the kind of person nobody could fully partner with as an equal, was the specific knowledge, carried in the back seat with the Calder file as he drove north in the March fog, that every person who had stood beside him in the work had paid for the privilege, and that he had never found a way, in 26 years, to make that not true. There is a particular kind of solitude that exceptional capability produces, one that has nothing to do with the absence of people around you and everything to do with the absence of anyone positioned to meet you as a genuine equal in the specific territory where your capability operates. Harry Callahan had been surrounded by colleagues for 26 years, had worked alongside 11 formal partners and countless other officers in less formal configurations, and had never, in any of those configurations, encountered someone whose operational capability matched his own closely enough to eliminate the calibration gap that had cost Driscoll a shoulder and Kowalski his confidence and Eddie Morrison his life. This was its own form of isolation, distinct from the isolation Claire's death had produced and distinct from the isolation of the city's structural ingratitude, but related to both in the way that all of Harry's various solitudes were ultimately related. Each one a different facet of the same underlying condition, which was the condition of a man who had become, through some combination of natural aptitude and 26 years of relentless accumulation, more capable than the structures around him were designed to accommodate. The partnership system assumed rough equivalence between partners, or at least a manageable gap that mentorship could close over time. Harry's gap had never closed, because the gap was not a function of inexperience that time would resolve but a function of something closer to a difference in kind, and every partner who entered the gap entered it knowing, on some level, that they were not working alongside an equal, and paid, in their various ways, for the specific psychological and sometimes physical cost of that knowledge.